Welcome to Chapter by Chapter. I am your host, Brian Thomas Kropp, and I believe that stories have a tremendous power for good, and so I write them, and I enjoy sharing them with you. If you are new to this show, then the way we operate here is that I will read a chapter from a story that I have written. In this case, it is book 2 in the Pearl Saga. The book's official title is Shell Game. And after we read that chapter, I will go into a little in-depth on some Easter eggs, some why did I write things the way that I wrote them. If you're interested in writing stories from your own, there may be some nuggets here and there about the writing process that I have that may be helpful for you as well. Last week, I mentioned that we were changing the name of the show. It had been named after me, the Brian Thomas Kropp podcast, and that it was hard for anybody to know what the show was about because nobody knows what a Brian Thomas Kropp is. So we changed the name to Chapter by Chapter, but also I've started putting the recordings of these on YouTube. Now, don't get too excited, though I know of several people who will listen to videos on YouTube for their own amusement instead of watching them. This is not being webcast. There is no video of me in this recording. It's just the audio, very similar to this. But if you'd like to go over to YouTube or you think that'd be an easier invite, you can go to let people know about that. There'll be a link to the YouTube channel in the show notes. But we're going to try that and see how that goes for just a little bit to see if other people can find the show. One of the goals I have in writing generally is just to communicate with people. And so I'm going to try as many avenues as possible just to connect with people. So if podcasts make sense for you, fantastic. If YouTube does, also good. This story is over on my blog for free. You can go read it there. You can go to Amazon and buy a copy. Really, I just want to connect with you. So that's what the purpose of this is, and I am glad that you are a part of the show. Well, we will get into Chapter 2 of Shell Game right after we hear from this week's sponsors. Chapter 2. Less than a half hour later, Evan heard the front door open, followed by the sound of muffled voices in the reception area. Evan straightened his tie and smoothed his hair as he listened to the click-clack percussion of high heels approaching on the waxed floor tiles. Letting out a long breath and bracing for Sophie's re-entry, he secretly hoped that whatever problem had just walked in would be a turn toward good things. The door to his office opened and Sophie entered alone and smiled. Evan tried to look past Sophie to see who might be in the lobby. "What do you have for me?" Evan said and gripped the armrest of his chair. "There's a woman out there," Sophie nodded back to the reception area. "She says she saw your ad in the phone book." Evan shook his head. "Is that right? You want me to show her in? Does she look like she has money?" Sophie stepped closer to him and lowered her voice. "Evan Gold, I realize that your life is in a bad way, but this is a real person, not just a payday. We're still, I think, in the business of helping people." Evan sighed and wiped his forehead. "You're right. Sorry. I'll snap out of this eventually. Go ahead and show her in." "Evan," Sophie made sure she locked eyes with her boss. "She looks scared." "I'm sure she does," Evan said. Sophie walked over to the side of Evan's desk and whispered, "But," then stopped suddenly and looked back toward the door. "What is it?" Evan said. "Is everything okay?" Sophie stiffened her back and shook the feelings from her head. "I'll show her in," she said, and exited the office. A moment later, Sophie returned. Following her was a creature that seemed to have walked off the pages of a fashion magazine. The woman wore a sleeveless silk dress, navy with white trim, and a neat bow over her waist. Gracing her trim neck was a delicate gold chain. In her gloved hand, she carried a matching navy pocketbook. A real Times Square looker, Evan thought. She was possibly the most beautiful woman Evan had ever seen. He was instantly confused as to whether this was a sign of good tidings or not. "This is Molly Brandt," Sophie said, making introductions. Evan stood to greet his guest, his mind focused on any facial tic, any cue from her hands, any indication from this woman's body language what her angle was. "Miss Brandt, this is Evan Gold." Evan Gold smiled and extended his hand. "Thank you very much for seeing me, Mr. Gold." Molly blushed, taking Evan's hand in hers. Her voice sounded husky and tranquil, like wind blowing through pines, and Evan thought he detected just the hint of sorrow in it. "Glad to meet you, Miss Brandt," he said. "It is Miss Brandt." She nodded. "Please have a seat." He looked back at Sophie. "Thank you, Miss Landis." Sophie exited the office, and once again, Evan motioned for Miss Brandt to take a seat. After he did, Evan sat behind his desk and noticed this woman had difficulty making eye contact. Once she had satisfactorily adjusted herself in the seat, she only slightly raised her head to Evan and gave a weak and almost apologetic smile. "How can I help you today, Miss Brandt?" The woman pulled a white handkerchief from her pocketbook and dabbed at her eyes. "Mr. Gold," she began, but then stopped. She put the cloth over her mouth. "Let's start with something simple," Evan began. "My secretary says you found our offices through an ad we don't have, so how exactly did you find us?" The woman shook her head slightly and stood quickly. "I shouldn't have come. I'm sorry to have wasted your time, Mr. Gold. You must have more important things to concern yourself with than my small problems." She turned to leave. "Now, hold on a moment." Evan stood and walked to her. "You just got here. You have a lot on your mind. There's nothing else on my schedule. Why don't you just have a seat, take a moment, and when you're ready, you can tell me what's going on." The woman turned her head toward Evan. "Oh, Mr. Gold," was all she could get out before she broke down in sobs. Evan guided her back to her chair and then poked his head out of the office door and asked Sophie to bring in some water. Evan sat on the edge of his desk and looked at the woman. He couldn't tell if this show of emotion was honest or a play for his sympathies. She'd started on the wrong foot with the blatant lie about the ad, but people in duress can think all kinds of things are absolute that aren't. He told himself he should give her a chance at least to tell her story. After all, wasn't she the kind of person he got in the business for? The vulnerable people with nowhere else to turn? They couldn't all be liars and cheats, could they? Could they? He decided to let this play out a few moments longer, take this situation at face value instead of assuming the worst in people. The woman took a moment to regain her composure, and Sophie entered with a pitcher and glass of water on a tray. The woman took the glass and thanked Sophie. "Anything else?" Sophie asked from behind the woman. Silently, she bulged her eyes back at Evan and pursed her lips before mouthing, "Help her." "No, thank you, Miss Landis. We're fine," Evan said. Sophie glared at Evan while she exited and closed the office door behind her. "First of all, Miss Brandt," Evan began, "you can stop calling me Mr. Gold. Call me Evan. I've never been one for formality." The woman finally made eye contact with Evan. Her perfect azure irises connected with Evan's brown ones. Adrenaline shot through his body. "Thank you, Evan. Please call me Molly." "That's better," Evan smiled. "Molly." Evan moved back to sit in his chair. "See? I think we'll get along just fine. Now, let's start at the beginning. What brought you in today?" "It's my father," Molly said. "He's missing. He's run off to join the circus, so to speak." "Any reason you can think of why your father would do that?" Evan asked. "There's a man. Jason Charles is his name. You have to understand, Mr. Gold. Evan. My father is the kindest, sweetest of men. However, that kindness makes him, how should I put it, a little gullible." "I see. And you think this Jason Charles," Evan coaxed. "My understanding is that Mr. Charles sold my father on a story of how he could make a quick dollar. Now he's stringing my father along and depleting our savings. To say I'm concerned," she dabbed at her eyes, "my mother and sister are also concerned. We were able to cobble together enough money for me to take the train here and see if I could find him." "Why do you think your father is in Athens? This isn't exactly a tourist destination," Evan smirked and pointed out his dingy windows. "Mother received a letter from him. The return address was from here," Molly said. "Do you have the letter with you?" Molly shook her head. "What did the letter say?" Evan asked. "Oh," Molly waved her hand in mock carelessness, "that he was fine and not to worry. Can you believe it? He said not to find him. So, naturally, I was on a train the next day. I went to the address as soon as I got here, the address on the letter, but the landlord said that she hadn't seen my father in a few days. Molly once again covered her face in her handkerchief to hide her emotions. Mr. Gold, I'm so worried. I can't even begin to tell you. Did you uncover any information about where your father might have moved to? Evan asked. By fortune, I happened to run into Mr. Charles, and I can tell you, undeniably, that he is a cad and a rounder, and I wouldn't be surprised if he didn't have ties to one of those organized crime families back east. I see, Evan repressed a smirk. That aside, did Charles say anything about your father's whereabouts? No, not really. Molly pinched her nose with her handkerchief and sniffed. Sorry, Mr. Gold. Evan, I'm an absolute mess. Evan thawed and rocked back in his chair. He reached forward and played with a stray pencil. So you don't even know if your father is still in Athens. He could be miles from here. Did you consider that? Maybe your father is fine. Maybe he and Charles split up. Why does there have to be something nefarious going on? I know this may be hard to hear, but sometimes men get a mind to wander, and they will leave the safety of hearth and home and do all kinds of foolishness. I'm not saying I agree with it, mind you, but I wouldn't say there's necessarily a crime involved here. Maybe he just wants to be left alone. And after a while of sowing whatever wild oats he has left, he'll come back. Molly looked hard into Evan's eyes. I'd at least want him to tell me. I'd want him to tell that to my face. I just want to see him. And if he wants to do whatever it is, as you say, men do at this time in their life, which is ridiculous, by the way, then so be it. But I want to be able to tell my mother and sister that he's okay. But her voice trailed off. But the landlord hasn't seen him. Charles says, Evan began, then stopped. What did Charles say again? Is your father still in town? He didn't say. Molly looked at the floor, though I guess he must be. She looked back up at Evan. I worked out a meeting with Mr. Charles tonight. He said he would bring my father, so yes, he must be in town, right? Maybe. If this Jason Charles is a con man, I think it would be safe to distrust much of what he says. Have you thought about that? What if your father doesn't show up? Evan asked. Then I guess I'll just meet with Mr. Charles. There has to be something he can tell me about my father. She shot her eyes back at Evan. Once again, Evan felt the electricity of her gaze. I simply can't go back home empty-handed, Mr. Gold. She looked down. I mean, Evan. Outside his door, Evan heard the front door jangle open again and the confident, rhythmic stride of his partner, Gabe Silver, approaching the office door. So last week we introduced you to the lead character named Evan Gold and sort of a sidekick character named Sophie Landis. And in this chapter, we meet a new character that will be very important to the whole story, whose name is Molly Brandt. And there at the very tail end, we got a glimpse of another character that will be very important to the story that we'll get into next episode, named Gabe Silver. But one of the things I'm realizing about this series, I don't know that this will play out in the third book, but at least for these two, that there are aspects of the naming of things. And if you're a longtime listener of this show, you will know that I'm lousy at naming things. And so there was a place that in the last book in Showdown in the Yukon that they were headed to named Penny Canyon. And I got to Penny Canyon from misheard lyrics from a Counting Crows song where the real lyrics were up in the canyon, and somehow I heard it as Penny Canyon. Well, Evan Gold's name is also from some misheard lyrics. In this case, it's from a group called the Grey Havens, which a friend of mine introduced me to the Grey Havens, I guess probably now like a decade ago, and I've been listening to their music ever since, apparently not all that carefully. There's a song that they have called Diamonds and Gold, that just happens to thematically fit sort of the genesis of this whole series, which very loosely is based on a parable that Jesus taught about a man who goes out into a field and discovers a treasure in the field and then sells everything that he has in order to buy that field so that he could have the treasure, because the treasure in the ground that he didn't have was greater than the treasure that he did possess. And so he was able to risk all that. That little tiny germ of a thought spun out in all this stuff, and it's really hard to locate that parable anymore, but that's sort of where it started. And that's sort of where the song Diamonds and Gold kind of is about. But the misheard lyrics were in verse 2, where the real lyrics are, "It was dark, it was cold, having gold couldn't stop the night." But I heard, "It was dark, it was cold, Evan Gold couldn't stop the night." And I thought, Evan Gold, that's a great name for something. And I've got this book about gold. Wouldn't it be hilarious if they were looking for gold in the first book and then the next guy's last name is Gold? So that's where the name Evan Gold came from. And then his partner, I thought, well, it wouldn't be funny to have gold and silver. So I then ended up naming a guy Gabe Silver. But anyway, so that's where that came from. The other thing that I was trying to get accomplished in this story was to very blatantly, with a 2x4, let you know that we're no longer in the 1800s in the Old West. We are no longer even where Showdown in the Yukon ended, which was right at the turn of the 19th into the 20th century. We are much further in. And so I'm trying my dead level best to say we're in 1960, I think, 2. I kept trying to find references from 1962. So Kennedy is president. I'm just trying to get everything kind of in that mood. I know a lot of crime noir stories, of which this is one. When I think of them, they are movies from the 1930s, 1940s, and I didn't want this to be kind of a black and white book. I wanted this to be kind of a Technicolor story. So I moved it into the 60s, where a lot of these stories don't take place, and was introducing as many things as I could factually that said, we're in the 1960s. So there's not a lot of smoking. I think in the last chapter, there was the smell of cigarette ash as you come in. There was a particular kind of desk that Sophie is sitting at that was very indicative of the time. The linoleum floors and those kinds of things. So the fact that when Molly Brandt comes in, she's still wearing gloves with this outfit that she wears, that's sort of indicative of that early 1960s time, a holdover from previous decades. That I think by the end of the 1960s, you were not wearing gloves with dresses so much anymore. But that's where we are with this. And then the last sort of nugget, there's no way anyone other than maybe my brother would have caught this. Emporia, Kansas, of which Athens, Kansas is loosely based on, is, I think at one point it probably was sort of a tourist destination. Presidents visited there. It was kind of a big deal back in the 1910s or so. And it's not now at all. And for the most part, Kansas is not what's known as a tourist destination. There are places that people will go to tour for sure. But when you think of places like, hey, let's all go on vacation, Kansas is not the first place that often comes to mind. And I was in a store, like a gift store, I think it was in Emporia, with my brother, and we ran across this shirt that was just fantastic. It sort of artistically was a knockoff of some Star Trek stuff. So it's a Star Trek font, stars, all that kind of stuff. And what it said was, instead of Star Trek, it said Kansas Trek, to boldly go where no tourist has gone before. I've often believed, and I think this is true, Kansas is a fantastic place to grow up. It is not the place you want to go visit. You go visit other places and you enjoy that, and then you come back to the real world, which Kansas provides a lot of, and it's a really good place to be and to grow up and to live. That doesn't mean you necessarily have to visit there. You go visit the beach, and you go visit the mountains, and you come home, kind of thing. So anyway, that's sort of what's going on in this. I think the biggest goal, other than introducing characters I had, was trying to let you know, the reader, that this is not the same story that book one was. And we are in a different decade. And some of this time travel, it's not really time travel, but some of this skipping around in time will play out probably a little bit more when we get to book three. But anyway, I forgot one small thing from the prologue last week. There was a story that I heard. I think this will come up later in the book too, but there was a story that I heard years and years and years ago. I think it was in Missouri. There was the Mississippi River had flooded one year, and the floodwaters ended up creeping into an old cemetery, like an old Civil War cemetery, and unearthed all of these caskets. And people were trying to figure out what to do with all this. And I thought, wouldn't it be hilarious if somebody found some Civil War treasure in these old coffins that had gotten washed up, which was an idea I'd had for a play years ago that never went anywhere. But that's also, I kind of grabbed that for how do I get the pearl loose? When last we saw the pearl in book one, the pearl is around Lucy, her neck as she's buried. So how does this pearl get loose again to be found, which is one of the themes and plot lines of this story. So that's how that happened, but that's sort of the history behind where a flood comes in and exhumes all the bodies. So I think that's all the details up to this point that are mildly interesting for these couple of chapters. I hope that you are so far enjoying the story. I think next week or the week after, the story really kicks off. And so far, we're just kind of laying some groundwork. But while we are doing that, there's a great opportunity to tell friends and family about the show. We've changed names. We're rocking and rolling. So come on back next week. Subscribe to the show wherever you do that. Feel free to leave ratings and reviews. I'd love to get to know you just a little bit better. So you can do that over at brianthomascrop.com. You can sign up for my reader group. I'll send you some goodies just in exchange for your email address, and then we can stay in contact with one another. But I hope to have you back here next time as we jump into chapter 3 of Shell Game. Until then, I hope you have a great week.